Okay, so as I said, Boaz has these three lines of argument for legalizing drugs. And I want to talk about each of these lines of argument in a bit more detail. We'll have a presentation on each, right? And so the first line of argument he offers doesn't really make reference to rights at all. It's just an argument that drug laws don't work. They don't work supposedly in that they don't prevent use, right? Even if we might think preventing drug use, drug abuse is a good thing, if drug laws don't do that, then they're just a waste of resources, right? Literally setting money on fire, getting nothing for it if they don't work. So that would be a very good reason to get rid of drug laws if they don't work. Now, here's the question though. Does Boaz give us a good argument for thinking drug laws don't work? Does he give us convincing evidence for this claim? He actually has a few different lines of argument, a few different claims he makes to try to show this, so we can break Boaz's argument down a little further. So let's zoom out a little bit, look at the arguments he offers for this claim that drug laws don't work, then come back in and look at each of these lines of argument in a bit more detail. So Boaz's three arguments for claiming, or three bits of evidence for claiming that drug laws don't work, are that drugs are illegal, but people still use, right? We've made drugs illegal, but not only do people still use, there are still addicts, right? Drug laws worked. Wouldn't it stop people from using? They still use, so drug laws don't work. The failure of prohibition. As you guys know, in the 20s into the very early 30s, the US experimented with making alcohol illegal. It was illegal to make alcohol or sell it. Weirdly enough, it wasn't illegal to drink it. A lot of people exploited that loophole, right? But the claim is, look, we made alcohol illegal during the Prohibition. Prohibition was a miserable failure. It didn't work. It didn't prevent people from drinking. We can generalize from this failure of prohibition to stop people from drinking alcohol to drug laws generally. If prohibition doesn't work or didn't work, then drug laws generally won't work either. Finally, more enforcement and heavier penalties don't prevent drug use. If drug laws really worked, then you would think that more enforcement of the drug laws that are on the books, more cops out there looking for people violating drug laws, more agents at the border or on the ocean or whatever looking for people smuggling them in, you would think that would do something to cut drug use. Boaz's claim is that it doesn't, and if it doesn't, then that shows that drug laws don't work. Just a waste of resources. So let's look at each of these arguments for this larger claim that drug laws don't work in turn. The first of these is the people still use argument. And so a lot of this class, is going to be evaluating arguments. So here's this argument in outline. And I'll give it to you guys, and I want you to think, don't think that your computer's on the fritz or something, because I'm going to give you a second to think about this. Think about whether this is a good argument. Do the premises prove the conclusion? Is it valid? And do you accept the premises? So the people still use argument. If drug laws worked, people wouldn't use drugs. People still use drugs. So drug laws don't work. Is this a valid argument? Think about that for a second. In fact, it is. If A, then B. Well, think about, you remember modus tollens. If A, then B, not B, so not A, That's the form of this argument, so it is in fact a valid argument. Well, but remember, we have to ask another question to determine if a valid argument is a good one, right? Valid argument means if the premises are true, then the conclusion can't be false. But to say an argument's valid still leaves open the question, are the premises true or not? Think about that. Is this a sound argument? Do you think these premises are true? Would you accept them? Well, I think you should actually be a bit skeptical about this argument. Why is that? Well, think about it. Replace drug laws and drugs with some other things, right? See if the argument still seems plausible to you. Well, if you're wondering, let's think a bit more about this question. What do we mean about drug laws working or not? So I think there's two different things we can mean by saying a law works. You might mean if the law works, no one does what the law prohibits, or everyone does what it tells us to do, right? The other thing you might mean, if the law works, people do less of what the law prohibits or more of what it tells us to do. Now look, if we say for a law to work, it has to be the case that everyone does what it tells us to or no one does what it prohibits. Well, is any law ever going to work? I mean, obviously not, right? We have laws against speeding. You go out on the interstate or even one of the main roads in Virginia Beach or Norfolk, people will speed. I live out in Ocean View, so I'm on Ocean View Avenue a lot. People speed on Ocean View Avenue, right? People are supposed to do 35. They do a lot more than 35, right? I will admit, when I'm driving that road, I probably do a bit more than 35, and people ride my bumper on an inch or two away because they're frustrated I'm not going fast enough when I'm doing 45, right? But look, does that show that laws against speeding don't work? Or take another question, right? We have laws against murder, but people still commit murder. Would you say that laws against murder don't work? No, obviously not, right? A more sensible standard, and what we mean when we talk about any law working, does it really get people to do less of what it tells them not to do or more of what it tells them to do, right? Imagine a world where we didn't have any speed limit on the interstate or on the main roads in Norfolk, Virginia Beach. There was no speed limit on Ocean View Avenue. How fast? It turns into Shore Drive, the section of Virginia Beach. No speed limit on Ocean View Avenue / Shore Drive. How fast do you think people would go then? Now they do 45, 50. If there were no speed limit at all, I'm betting some people would do 80, 90, 100 miles an hour, right? People still commit murder. Well, what if we lived in a world where there were no laws about murder at all? There would be a lot more murder, right? So this is a bad argument, right? It is a valid argument, but I think that the sense of work that we're interested in with most laws is sense two, that it does something to prevent the behavior it outlaws or encourage the behavior it tells us to do. And so if we take that sense, then premise one is obviously false. This is a valid argument. It is not a sound or cogent argument, right? So the next argument Boaz gives us turns on the supposed failure of prohibition. You guys can probably already tell I'm a little skeptical about this argument. I'm using the word supposed, but let's go through it. So the argument goes like this. If drug laws worked, then prohibition being banning alcohol, would have cut alcohol use. Prohibition did not cut alcohol use, so drug laws do not work. So this argument is, in one sense, a better argument in that it has a better standard, a more sensible standard of what it is for a law to work, right? Doesn't mean if we outlaw alcohol, nobody ever is going to drink. It just means that if we outlaw alcohol and laws against drug use work, then it would cut alcohol use. That is our standard. Well, claim is prohibition did not cut alcohol use, right? And, we all know this, right? We all know, oh, well, prohibition was a miserable failure. Not only did people keep drinking, but drinking got to be more glamorous. If anything, it backfired and people drank more. Or supposedly that's what we all know. I'll put "no" in scare quotes here, right? Come back and see whether that's actually true. So drug laws do not work. Again, is this a valid argument? Yes, it is. If A, then B, not B, so not A. Again, it uses this argument form modus tollens. It's a valid argument. If the premises are true, conclusion is true as well. So now we have to get into this question of whether it is a sound or cogent argument, right? Depending on the jargon you want to use. Do we accept the premises? Are they true premises? I'm not sure we should or can accept these premises. I actually think both 1 and 2 are open to doubt. Well, why do I say this? Well, premise 1 generalizes from alcohol to all drugs, right? It's saying, well, if banning this one particular drug, alcohol, doesn't work, then putting restrictions on other drugs won't work either. But do we really want to accept that? Is that really true? And one of the things we should ask ourselves, is alcohol like all other drugs, or are there features of alcohol that might make alcohol special? Are there reasons to think that restrictions on alcohol might have a harder time succeeding than restrictions on other drugs? And in fact, there are. For one thing, alcohol is very easy to make. It is way easier to make than most other drugs. Look, I'm not going to sit here and give you guys step-by-step instructions for brewing your own alcohol. Some of you do it and probably are better at it than I am, I'm guessing. But it's not hard to make alcohol. I did it last Christmas. I got interested. One of my little home projects was to try to make some cider, hard cider. Trust me, I'm not great at it. I didn't put a lot of work into it. It wasn't yummy. It wasn't the greatest cider in the world. It wasn't terrible. It was just really tasteless, right? But it would get you drunk. It had alcohol in it. It is not hard to do. All you need to do to make some alcohol is to get something that has some sugar in it, get some yeast, which they all, very easy to buy at the store. People bought it during the store Prohibition. Dump a little yeast in that thing that has sugar in it. If you use the standard bread yeast, whatever you make with it probably is not going to taste great. But again, it will have alcohol in it. It will get you drunk, right? very, very easy to make alcohol. It is much harder to make most other drugs, right? You get some fruit juice and a spoonful of yeast, you can have alcohol in a few weeks. Is it that easy to make meth? Is it that easy to make acid? Is it that easy to make heroin or cocaine? I don't know. I've never tried it, but from everything I've seen, no, it's not. It's much, much harder to make all those drugs. So that's one reason to think that alcohol is different. Another reason to think alcohol is different, and another reason to think that we can't just go from the failure of prohibition to saying that drug laws generally don't work, is that during prohibition, alcohol was still legal in all the countries around the US. You could still buy alcohol in Mexico. You could still buy alcohol in Canada. Look, hard drugs are illegal in Mexico and Canada, different than alcohol, right? There are stories, some people in Prohibition would set up stills in their backyard and make their own alcohol. The main way that people brought alcohol into the US, or one of the main ways, was that they would just go up to Canada, buy a bunch of alcohol, bring it in, right? Didn't even have to make your own suspicious, dodgy, whatever. You just go up to Canada. You can come back with gallons and gallons of Seagram's whiskey, right? And people did that during Prohibition. You cannot just go up to Canada, go in any store, and buy pounds and pounds of heroin, right? So again, another way that alcohol is different. Another reason for doubting this conditional, another reason for doubting we can draw a lesson from, failure of prohibition, failure of laws restricting alcohol to cut alcohol use, to the claim that all laws against drug use are just not going to work. The final reason here, and perhaps even more important than one or two, is just that alcohol is accepted in American culture, and it plays a role in our culture in a way that no other drug does, with the possible exception of marijuana, right? Marijuana also might satisfy number one. It might be more like alcohol than other drugs. Maybe we can draw a lesson there for legalizing marijuana from the failure of prohibition. I don't know. I don't have a dog in this fight. I don't particularly care about this issue. When I make arguments that we should legalize marijuana, I feel like students think that I probably have a bong in my living room. I do not, right? Philosophically, I think they might be good arguments, but personally, doesn't really affect me. Anyway, back to my point. We accept alcohol in our culture, and it plays a role in our cultural practices in a way that most drugs don't. Think about this, right? You go over to a friend's house to watch a football game or a baseball game, and one of the first things they'll do, at least for a lot of people, is say, hey, do you want a beer from the fridge, right? You go over to a friend's house to play video games, and they might ask you, hey, when you come over, bring a six-pack, right? That does not hold true for heroin or cocaine, right? It's a pretty common Super Bowl party where somebody says, when you get there, hey, do you want a beer? It would be a very uncommon Super Bowl party when somebody says, when you get there, oh, do you want some cocaine? It's a very common nod to playing video games so that somebody says, oh, on the way over, grab a six-pack. In my experience of playing video games, maybe you've had a different one, but in mine, and I'm going to wager most people's, it's not very common for somebody to say, oh, would you grab a little heroin on the way over so we can do that, right? You will even get alcohol in many churches on Sunday. Go to a Lutheran church or a Catholic church, you'll get alcohol with communion. Alcohol plays a role in our culture that no other drug, with the possible exception of marijuana, and even that one I don't think plays quite the role alcohol does. But heroin, cocaine, meth certainly don't play the role alcohol does. Yet another reason to think that we can't really generalize from the supposed failure of prohibition to prevent alcohol use to this more general claim that drug laws don't work. Alcohol seems like it's special for all these reasons. Final reason to be skeptical here of this line of argument is that actually premise 2 seems like it might be false. Premise 2, prohibition did not cut alcohol use. Well, actually, there's some pretty good evidence that it did. My source for all this is a very good book, Drugs and Drug Policy, What Everyone Needs to Know. Mark Kleiman, Jonathan Calkins, Angela Hawken wrote it. You can find it on Amazon. Very good on these issues of drug use, drug abuse. Very good with factual questions. Most of what I know about this issue comes from this book. As far as I can tell, very reliable. These guys don't seem to have any particular ideological axe to grind on this issue. And they cite 2 reasons for thinking prohibition did cut alcohol use. In the early years of prohibition, cirrhosis of the liver deaths fell. They went down. Cirrhosis of the liver, there are other causes of it besides alcoholism. The main thing that causes cirrhosis of the liver is heavy drinking, alcoholism, right? There's good evidence. They keep records on this, causes of death. Death from cirrhosis of the liver did fall by a noticeable amount in the early years of prohibition. Another thing that fell during the early years of prohibition was admissions of people to the hospital for so-called alcohol psychosis. People would be admitted to mental institutions in the hospital for this. It went down in the early years of prohibition. Now, later years of prohibition went back up as far as they can tell. Later years of prohibition, a lot of people had given up on enforcement. By the time they repealed prohibition, most everybody was kind of just like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Alcohol's illegal. By the way, here's a drink, right? No one cared. By the end, they weren't doing a serious job of enforcing it. But in the early days when they were, we do have some pretty good evidence that it cut drinking. So, argument just doesn't work. There's good reason to doubt premise 1, the conditional, but there's also pretty good reason to doubt premise 2, right? So, Boaz has not shown with this argument that drug laws don't work. So let's look at Boaz's final argument. And I think this is the best of the 3 if you're going to argue that drug laws don't work. And this argument is that more enforcement of drug laws and heavier penalties for selling or using drugs don't cut drug use. And again, I think we can put Boaz's argument in a pretty simple form, a conditional, a claim, and then a conclusion that drug laws don't work. If drug laws worked, then more enforcement and or heavier penalties would cut use. Neither more enforcement nor heavier penalties cut use, so drug laws don't work. Again, I'm not going to bore you guys with this. We've already looked at the other 2. It has the same form. It is a valid argument, right? Modus tollens again. If A, then B, not B, so not A. valid form of argument, well, we have to go back, ask, is it a cogent argument? Do we buy these premises? Well, the truth is that premise 2 definitely seems to be true. Now look, there's always going to be some trouble with determining drug use, right? You can't just do a Gallup poll, call up people and say, hey, sir, have you done cocaine and or heroin and or marijuana in the last month? And if so, can you tell me how much, right? If a random person calls you and asks those questions about illegal drugs, you might hang up on him, and if you don't, you might very well lie to him, right? But as far as we can tell, more enforcement doesn't seem to make use go down. Heavier penalties don't seem to make use go down. And here's an example of this. As Boaz notes, we've had heavier enforcement. Drug use doesn't seem to go down a whole lot. Lighter enforcement, it doesn't seem to shoot up. He's right about this, and here's a very specific example. In the 80s, we really, as a society, came down pretty heavy on cocaine use, right? We devoted a lot of resources to enforcement. We really upped the penalties for using cocaine, especially crack cocaine. And guess what? The use didn't fall. Now, again, it's hard to get clear information on this, but as far as we can tell, use did not fall. If it fell very, very little. There's even some evidence that it went up some. Again, this is from the Drugs and Drug Policy, What You Need to Know book, but other sources I've looked into seem to confirm this. There might be some disagreement around the edges, but it really didn't go down a whole lot and might have even went up a bit, even though we put a lot more resources in enforcement and we upped penalties as a society. So premise 2, from what I can tell, definitely seems to be true. More enforcement doesn't make use go down. Okay then, so is this good proof that drug laws just don't work? I actually don't think it is, but I think to see why this is, to see why we should maybe resist this conclusion, I think we can actually learn some things about drug laws and maybe even, if we don't quite buy Boaz's legalize everything argument, I do think this makes a point of why we should maybe reform drug laws. So let's take a step back and ask ourselves, how would or how does making drugs illegal prevent use? And I think there are 3 main ways that making drugs illegal will prevent use. First thing it will do is to make it in a sort of way disreputable, or you might hear socially stigmatized, or basically just to say it's sketchy to do drugs, right? Because it's illegal, it has a kind of social stigma. People don't want to do it in a way that it wouldn't if it were legal, right? And look, there are certain people who won't do things simply because they're illegal, and more widely, even if we might, still do some things, even if they're illegal, there's a certain sort of, it's not so reputable, it's kind of sketchy, we might hesitate a bit more, right? The second thing that making drugs illegal does to prevent use is it makes it harder to get drugs, right? Alcohol, if you're 21, I can walk half a block to the 7-Eleven near my house and get some alcohol, but it's not so easy to get any kind of drugs, right? I mean, I'm guessing if I wanted to do it, I could, but it takes more effort, right? The final thing that making drugs illegal does to prevent use is to make drugs more expensive. In fact, as far as researchers can tell, this is the main thing it does to prevent use. Well, now let me ask you guys this. If these are the main things, the main ways that making drugs illegal might prevent use, is heavier enforcement or heavier penalties going to make much of a difference? Look at the first one. The simple fact it's illegal is what makes it disreputable, sketchy, kind of sleazy to do, right? More penalties. If you're thinking, oh, is this a kind of sketchy thing to do? You're not going to think, oh, well, if I do it, I go to jail for a year versus 2 years versus 3 years. You're just going to think, well, is it illegal or not, right? So more enforcement, heavier penalties are probably not going to do a lot on this dimension to make a real difference. Making drugs harder to get. Well, look, there might be fewer dealers if penalties are higher. And they might be more careful if there are more police out there. But how much of a difference is this really going to make, right? If getting caught selling drugs is a year penalty versus a 5-year penalty versus a 10-year penalty, well, in any of those cases, you're not going to be doing it as openly as the 7-Eleven sells beer, right? So just making drugs illegal is going to do a lot to make them harder to get. More enforcement, more penalties, probably not going to move things a lot on that dimension. Finally, drug laws make drugs more expensive. Well, here it might be an open question. Well, you might think, well, dealers are going to charge more if they run more risk. There's more enforcement, supply will go down, so drugs will get more expensive. There might seem to be a case that more enforcement would make drugs more expensive, help on this area. That might be one way that they make, that more enforcement will make drug laws more effective. Turns out this doesn't seem to be the case, though. Most of the price increase in drugs, as far as they can tell, comes from just making them illegal. But after a certain point, more enforcement, heavier penalties do very little to drive up the price. There's a concept in economics called diminishing returns. And it's very relevant here. If you guys haven't come across it before, if you take any econ classes, you will, but it applies in some other areas too. And it applies with drug enforcement and heavier penalties, right? If you make a drug illegal and put any kind of legal penalty on it, even if it's just a sort of slap on the wrist, go to jail for a week or two, you're going to drive up the price a lot from what it would be if it were legal. Well, it turns out that more enforcement, heavier penalties, they'll drive up the price a bit, but after a certain point, they do very little to drive it up a bit more. I mean, diminishing returns, the basic idea is after a certain point, more of something gets you less of something in return. I mean, you guys can think about this with houses, right? If you don't have any money, you can't buy a house at all. Well, if you only have $100,000, you might not be able to get, especially in the really high market in this area, you might not be able to get the house you want, but you can probably buy something, right? There's a huge difference between no dollars and 100,000. There's probably a big difference between 100,000 and 200,000, right? The $200,000 house is much nicer. There's a difference between the $300,000 house and the $200,000, but probably not as big. When you get to a certain point, though, if a house is $3 million versus the other house that's $3 million, $100,000, well, the extra $100,000 is probably not going to make a big difference, right? Maybe you get a bit more gold somewhere, or maybe instead of 2 swimming pools it has 3. There's not going to be a big difference. After a certain point, more money spent on a house makes way less difference in how nice it is, right? Diminishing returns. And in the same way, after a certain point, more enforcement, heavier penalties, they will make a difference. They'll drive up drug prices a little bit, but not very much. Again, hard to tell, but as far as they can tell, the heavier enforcement in the 80s on cocaine did a little bit to drive up the price. The heavier penalties did too. But it was about 10%, right? And now let me ask you guys this. If you drink coffee or you drink beer or whatever, if the price goes up by 10%, are you really going to drink less of it? Probably not. And if you do, I might just not be a terribly savvy shopper. I probably wouldn't even notice the difference, right? But if you do notice the difference, it's not like you're going to go from 2 cups a day to 1 cup a day, or 2 cups a day of coffee to 1 cup every few days as a special occasion. And it's certainly not like you're going to give up drinking coffee, right? So I think all this shows that even if heavier penalties, more enforcement don't make much of a difference, it still might be the case that simply making drugs illegal makes a big difference in how widely people use. So Boaz's argument, I think, fails to show that we should legalize drugs. His best argument is that more enforcement, heavier penalties don't seem to make a big difference, but even that argument doesn't show that making drugs illegal doesn't make a difference. Now here's the thing though, I think this argument does show a few things though. This fact, and it does seem to be a fact, that more enforcement, heavier penalties doesn't seem to drive down use very much or at all. Well, what does it show? It probably, and I'm pretty sure this, I think it shows that we need to have some reform in drug laws. If heavier penalties, if sending people to jail for longer doesn't make much of a difference in how much people use drugs, well, that's a good reason to cut jail sentences, right? Look, for one thing, there's the cost to the people we send to jail, there's the cost to their communities, but even if we're just looking selfishly, it costs a lot of money to send people to jail, right? If we as a society don't need to spend that money, if shorter sentences for drug dealers or drug offenders will get us most of the deterrence, if they'll get us most of the cut in drug use that we want, then we probably are wasting money sending people to jail for a long time. We probably could do with less enforcement, right? If more enforcement doesn't really drive down use that much, well, there are plenty of things police could do that might be more useful than enforcing drug laws, right? We might even divert that money away from the police to other things besides police, right? At any rate, again, there are uses for the money on simply utilitarian grounds, right? Not even getting into issues of rights. On simple utilitarian grounds, what is going to create the most happiness? There are ways we could probably spend this money to create more happiness. So what has Boaz shown so far? I don't think he's shown that drug laws don't work. I don't think he's, in the sense that making drugs illegal doesn't prevent use. I think there's pretty good evidence that drug laws do prevent use. They drive up the prices of drugs. A lot of people who might try drugs aren't going to try them because of the price. A lot of people who use drugs will use less because of the price. We'll talk about this at the end of this unit. Even people who are heavy users, even people we might call addicts, will tend to use less when prices go up. So there are other ways drug laws might deter use, but they do drive prices up. Good reason to think, even Boaz would admit this in fact, good reason to think higher prices mean people will either not use or use less. So drug laws probably do something to prevent use. This argument fails, right? But I do think, just to sum up, I think Boaz has shown that we probably spend too much on punishing drug offenders and too much on enforcement. We could get most of the same level of deterrence. We could do just about as much to drive up the prices of drugs and to make drugs disreputable and to make it hard to get drugs with shorter sentences and less enforcement. So we're probably, as a society, wasting money, wasting resources on the level of enforcement we have. So Boaz doesn't show we need to legalize drugs. I do think this argument probably suggests we need to go in for some reforms. All right, so let's move on to Boaz's second line of argument, see if that gives us any reason to think, oh, we need to legalize drugs in the way Boaz wants.